So hello everyone, welcome to the Non-Traditional Career Preparation Root Causes webinar, a webinar for the Technical College System of Georgia. In the middle of the view screen right now we can see a web links pod that has a link to the NAEP website, the Root Causes and Strategies page, which is a very useful resource page for you to provide you with background material and additional resources to today's webinar. I'm going to move the pod back out and bring it back out again at the end of the webinar when we will be linking to the webinar evaluation. So the other way to access the Root Causes and Strategies page on the NAEP website is just to go to www.napequity.org. And on the home page on the right-hand side of the screen, there are blue buttons. You can see one titled Root Causes and Strategies. You can just click on that. But this is available to you. So you'll see the link down in the Browse To function. If you click on Browse To, it should open a separate window on your computer and take you directly to that web page. And then you can come back to the Adobe Connect room. But I'm going to move this web link pod out of the way so we can keep our chat pod in good view and be able to see everyone's conversations, which are the valuable things that we want to try to include today. So again, as a quick reminder, you can ask questions, engage in conversation in the chat function. And if you've joined us since we just started via the telephone, if you could mute your phones by pressing on *6 or using the mute function for your telephone, that would be great. The background noise to a minimum. All right, so let's get started. So I'm Mimi Lufkin, the CEO of the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity, and today we're going to talk about root causes related to increasing the participation and completion of students in non-traditional career and technical education programs. But I think that one of the things I'd like to ask you to do is, as we're talking about this specifically, is to reflect on these same issues, the same barriers that your special population students also face in accessing programs more broadly, CT programs more broadly on your campuses, because many of these root causes are very similar for any student who has particular barriers that require either additional student support services or changes in instructional strategies or a variety of things. And we'll get to all of those as we're talking about this. So although I'm going to focus today on looking at this in the context of non-traditional career preparation, would encourage all of you to reflect on this in relationship to special populations more broadly. And I'd like to encourage you to also in the chat box is to discuss that. You know, when we are talking about some root cause and you say, you know, I experienced the same thing with my single parent students, etc. You know, that'll help, I think, you think about this much more broadly as well. This is me. Of course, you can see me in the video screen as well. My email address is there. And again, today's webinar is for the Technical College System of Georgia, the Special Population Coordinator. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to reference our program improvement process for equity, which many of you are probably familiar with. I know that many of you have participated in training programs that we've conducted in the state for quite some time. More recently, we've just done a series of workshops over the last few years focused on micromessaging, which is a program that came out of this. But today's webinar is really focused on the component of the program improvement process where we look at what are the barriers that students are accessing, which is part of the Explore module. Excuse me, part of the Discover module in PIPE. But just to, as a reflection, I wanted to make sure you know or understand the context of this. So when we use this process, the very first step is the Explore step. And this step is really focused on looking at data and the exploration of performance gaps. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is to continue to collect data, look at data, identify student demographic information that helps you understand the nuances of who's participating where and who's not participating, who's performing or has achievement issues and who's not. And that's an important component of beginning this process so that you begin to understand where it is that you want to look to ensure that you can start to eliminate the barriers. So the Discover step is really about looking at root causes, those barriers at student access, and that's where we're going to focus today. I hope you're all aware of the fact that we'll be doing another webinar in 1 week that will focus on the select step, which is really about how do we take what we know about the barriers that students face and apply that knowledge to the selection of research-based strategies that we know can affect those particular root causes. So we'll be talking about that next week in relationship to recruitment and retention strategies. And then, of course, in the process, we also want to focus on implementation and evaluation, which is part of the ACT step. But for today, we're going to focus on discover. So what we're going to do is try to understand the research literature a bit, and I'm going to give you some references and resource documents that will help you study this more deeply, and we'll do an introduction to the root causes on today's webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about how do you create your own hypotheses, and I'm going to ask you to actually do that during this discussion, and you'll be able to share those with each other via the chat function. And then what are the strategies are you going to be using is basically where we're going to move in the next webinar. So today is focused on understanding the research and creating some hypotheses about the gaps, and then you'll be going out after this and identifying strategies in the webinar that we're focusing on next week. So why do we want to search for root causes? Why can't you just go out there and say, I'm going to do a mentoring program, or I heard about this great activity that I learned about at a conference, and I think it worked really well for them. I'm going to implement it in our institution. Or I know the issue is that everybody just needs financial resources to buy books, and if we could just do that, we'd have it all solved, right? And I know none of you probably are that simple about this, but it's an easy thing to do to, one, think that you know what all the answers are. We're educators. We like to solve problems. But it's also easy to think that just because something works somewhere else, it would work for you too. And if I could walk into every one of your institutions and say, here, these are the 5 things that I think, these are the 5 strategies. If you just implement these 5 strategies, we'll close all these gaps, and you'll have, your performance on the non-trad measure, for example, will improve dramatically. I would be walking around handing out bullets, and then I'd go lay on the beach. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. So what we know is that everybody's situation has its own culture, its own circumstances, its own nuances. And so it's really important that you understand what cause or permits, in this case, when we look at gender-based gaps in non-traditional career technical education access, it could, and then again, reflecting on that in relationship to special populations. So what are the barriers that create problems for access for students with disabilities, for example? And then which of those causes do you have control over and that you have the option or the opportunity to potentially ameliorate or help students deal with? So again, I just want to remind folks that if you're joining us on the computer today, to be sure to mute your phone if you're also on the telephone, and to mute your computer as well. Thank you. So this is the document that I want to be sure that you all download today, either during the webinar or you go to the web link that I shared with you at the beginning of the webinar and you get this document. Again, in the download handouts pod, if you click on root causes document, it'll download this entire document, which is a distillation of the research literature around root causes and strategies, basically over the last 20 years, and takes that literature and creates a framework for thinking about what are the barriers that students face. So I'm going to walk you through how to utilize this document. I have mine. I keep it with me at all times. It's my Bible. Here on my desk, and I would encourage you to do the same if this is something you want to look into more deeply after today's webinar, which I hope you will. The document itself basically is organized into a variety of sections, and one of the things we'll do today is to explore each of these sections more carefully and determine and have you begin to create some hypotheses about what you think those barriers are that you're facing in your own campus, and to begin to understand what the research says about root causes and strategies, so that it isn't just something you're making up, that you actually have evidence that can back up your potential theories or considerations. So there is a framework that exists that the root causes document has sort of distilled itself down to into these 5 areas. So in addition to this larger document that I shared with you, we've also created what I call a cheat sheet. It's a one-pager. It's a great handout to use with your colleagues if you're having discussions with them about this. And this is also a downloadable handout from the webinar you can get there, called Root Causes Document PDF. It's a one-pager document. And it includes the information about the framework, the theories, and then has some bulleted items related to the strategies. So think about this as Cliff Notes, and this is the much more complete. Of course, the third part of this is the actual research literature itself, but so they're all just condensing from one to the other. So this is the simplest form. But the nice thing about the one-pager is if you take a look at it, if you happen to have downloaded it yet, or you happen to have a copy of your own, is you'll see that the framework is created into these 4 areas. So there are root causes that really are very related to educational practice. So what's going on in schools, what's going on in classrooms. Definitely these are things that are under the control of educators, and they are very well defined and well supported in the literature, and we'll talk about those in a second. The next category is family, and you'll notice that it's a small section in here, but that doesn't mean that this isn't a really critical and important portion of the framework, because family engagement and family characteristics, everything from what kind of career they're engaged in to the socioeconomic status of the family affects career choice significantly, and the research in that area, although not as diverse or deep as in the education section, is still very compelling. There's also a section on career information, again an area that typically educators have significant control over. And then a section on internal and individual when we talk about social learning theories. For those of you who've been participating in the micromessaging training, you'll know that we focus a lot on this part of student identity, student self-efficacy, attribution, fixed versus growth mindset, etc. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. But I know that many of you who've been participating in the micromessaging training are beginning to probably feel like you're getting more comfortable with understanding those particular theoretical frameworks. But the research literature in this area is really becoming extremely important. Psychosocial research around learning is beginning to prove to be really significant, and having information and knowledge about this as educators becomes really very important. And then lastly, although not leastly by any means, is our societal issues. So what are the influences that occur from our society, the societal stereotypes, cultural stereotypes, and how they are messaged to students is another critical part of the framework that we'll discuss. So if you were to explore the larger document, the document that is the distillation of the research literature, I just wanted you to become a little familiar with it so that you can navigate it easily. The document itself is organized into each of the framework sections, so the 5 sections of the framework are part of the way the document is organized. And then for each framework section, there is underneath that each of the root causes. So for example here, under early intervention, which is a root cause that's part of the career information section, you'll see that there are 4 components that are identified in the document that support the root cause literature. So first of all, there's a statement of theory. So what exactly, when we say early intervention, what exactly does that mean? And the theory statement is included to describe what the literature says about the theoretical framework that supports research under earlier intervention. Then there's a brief summary of some, not all. This is not a totally comprehensive distillation by any means, but some of the evidence that is compelling, especially when we're focusing on non-traditional career preparation relationship to CTE. So then there's some brief summaries, and all of these items are referenced, and there's a complete reference section in the back of the document for those of you who write grants or need those kinds of things for maybe you're working on a master's thesis or a doctoral research project. This is a great resource for you. There's also then a section around recommendations and strategies, again supported by the research, and there's citations for all of these as well, so that you can see what are sort of generally what the recommendations and strategies are for addressing issues related to early intervention. Meaning, how do you talk about career information at elementary ages or young students. And then there are some sample effective practices and resources that are listed. Again, not a comprehensive list, just a few examples to give you some ideas and thinking about the creation of your own potential strategy that can support this. But this is how the document's organized. Today we're going to focus primarily on the theory and evidence section so that we get more knowledgeable about the root causes themselves. And then next time when we talk about strategies, we'll focus more on the recommendations and strategies and the effective practices and resources. We also have this document in an interactive format on our website. Again, the same link that I showed you earlier today, and we'll come back to it at the end of the webinar. You can go in, and we are constantly adding more effective practices and resources to that that piece around each of these root causes. So at this point, let me just make sure that we're all on track. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see anything coming up on the chat function. If we're all good, I'll keep moving forward. But this is maybe a good time to take a breath for a second and see if anybody has any questions or technical issues that they need addressed. If I don't see any typing happening here, I'll assume we're okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about each of these, and then I'm going to ask you to do some reflections, and we're going to look at each of these sections separately that are in the framework. And in an effort to understand that we're all able to read, and typically if I was to do this in a face-to-face setting, we would do a jigsaw exercise where we take the document and split it up amongst all of you, and you all could do the reading and then report back to each of us. Much more interactive. Unfortunately, webinars don't give us that opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these pieces so that we have a common set of knowledge. And then I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask you to do this especially throughout all of this, is if I touch on something that you go, oh yes, we're experiencing that, and if you have a story to tell or would like to share, that's a great thing to put into the chat function, because you all can hear me and I'm sure read about each other's stories and still maintain good engagement here. So I'm going to encourage you all to do that. So if I talk about something that you've seen or you've experienced or you even experienced yourself, please feel free to share that with everyone, and we'll get a good conversation going on. So when we look at non-traditional career preparation for men or women in this case, and we're talking about non-traditional careers where one gender is underrepresented by less than 25%, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with that terminology. Frequently we are talking about programs that have significant academic proficiency requirements, especially if they happen to be programs in the area of science, technology, engineering, and math. So whether it's men entering healthcare fields or women in technology, academic proficiency becomes a significant and important thing. And the interesting thing, especially I suspect from your perspective, is that frequently this issue begins in middle school when students have access to Algebra 1. So if a student does not have the ability, either because Algebra 1's not offered in their middle school, I heard that story yesterday when I was in DC Public Schools working with a group of teachers, or is discouraged from taking Algebra 1 or isn't prepared to take Algebra 1 by the 8th grade, that automatically puts them at a disadvantage for accessing a complete sequence of math courses through their high school experience, which of course when they arrive at your door again places them at somewhat of a disadvantage. Now the alternative to or the additional piece related to academic proficiency in this case is also this issue of remediation. And probably from your perspective in a community college, how is it that you bring students up to speed in order to even be able to enter academic programs, whether it's English courses or math courses, at their appropriate level when they enter the college? I know that one of our pilot sites that was doing this work in Pipe really focused on looking at student remediation or bringing students up to speed. And I may not use the right terminology, but the placement exams that students take and how those placement exams are used in order to identify areas of weakness that need to be improved, and then developing and designing programs that meet the needs of special population students in order to bring them up to academic proficiency. So frequently this can be a barrier to accessing CTE programs because a lot of times, and you can either validate this for me or not, these kinds of skills are critically important before students can enter any of the types of programs that we're talking about, especially those in STEM. So that becomes an issue. As far as access to participation in math, in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math-related programs of study, again, a barrier here can be very similar to the academic proficiency barrier, which has to do with, of course, the Algebra 1 access in middle school, which, realizing for you that's a long way down the pike, but certainly some influence that you can have in terms of providing guidance to administrators in school districts in your communities, but also whether or not programs are available to prepare students before they come to you, that whether they're dual enrollment programs, whether they're preparatory programs that occur at the high school level so that when students enter your career and technical education programs, they can either receive accelerated credit or dual credit for completing their technical certifications early or even on time with exceptional skills. So again, those can frequently be a barrier if a student is entering a CTE program, a high-tech CTE program in process technology, for example, in one of your community colleges, and have had no background knowledge or experience. They haven't had access to a pre-engineering program or even a technology-based program in their high school experiences. This can frequently be a barrier as well. As far as curriculum is concerned, and for those of you who've been involved in the micromessaging training, you'll know that we do a whole unit on this particular topic, and this notion of sort of the hidden curriculum in schools, and or the omission of underrepresented populations' perspectives in the curriculum, or curriculum that lacks relevancy, so it makes it more difficult for students to become engaged. And so by the time students have been through various curricular experiences in high school setting and they are trying to determine what career they want to choose, and if they've been through programs that have had sort of very traditional curricular focuses that have been either male or female, from a male or female perspective, depending on the dominant group in that world, the curriculum can also influence students' perceptions of whether they can be included in those career areas or not. And it's everything from problem-based learning, cooperative learning, and how that's managed in diverse settings, a variety of things like that, and how the curriculum reflects students of color or individuals who have individuals who are disabled, or men or women in non-traditional fields. The curriculum can also speak very loudly to cultural stereotypes. And so what are the reflections that occur in that? And that can happen even, certainly in preparation to when students come to you, but also how is that being reinforced in your own programs on your campuses? Do you see frequently the types of projects that students are required to participate or take or do are not necessarily relevant to their lives or their perspectives on the world? And does the curriculum speak to the heroes or sheroes of their own cultural backgrounds or perspectives? Who are the inventors that are highlighted in many of the technical programs? All of those kinds of things. Instructional strategies, there's certainly a significant amount of research around instructional strategies, methods, knowledge of learning styles, the ways in which interest can be characterized in terms of trying to generate interest in students. There's interesting research that exists out there around the fact that frequently females in STEM-related programs of study are particularly find it difficult or don't indicate interest in an area until they feel they have some competency first. And that isn't always the case for male students. In terms of the research literature, it shows us that there's a significant difference. So just because a female student, for example, doesn't show interest in a welding program doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have interest or potential for interest. It may actually mean that they are not familiar enough or feel comfortable enough with the program to actually indicate interest. So for those of you who are involved in using interest inventories and all of those kinds of things, we'll talk more about this in the other section related to career information. You have to be very careful about doing that. So there are a variety of instructional strategies that are important, and whether or not it's a drill and kill kind of environment, or lecture, or teachers who have the attitude, look to your left, look to your right. One of you or both of you will be gone by the end of the semester, as though that's a badge of courage. There are lots of things related to instructional strategies that can create barriers for students. There's a lot of research literature around school and classroom climate, and certainly when you reflect on the work we've been doing around micromessaging, this is very critical here. The ways in which teachers interact with students, whether students feel welcome, the whole sort of social emotional learning concepts that exist out there become really critically important. Do I feel included when I go to this classroom? Is the climate welcoming to me? Does the teacher care about me? I have yet to say anything about content, right? So it's not about, am I capable? Do I understand the curriculum material? Or is the teacher knowledgeable? None of those things actually, although they are important. And I'm not trying to dissuade that at all. But climate really is about this sort of sense of efficacy in relationship to being in the classroom. And you may have seen that with students where they're fearful about going to a particular class because they don't think the teacher likes them, or they don't like the teacher, or they don't feel welcome, or it may even have to do with the other students in the classroom. So how is it that they engage with others in class, and do they feel welcome by their peers as well? So these are very critical components of learning and education, and frequently are not focused on in a variety of ways, but can be the significant thing that makes a difference. And then lastly, of course, is support services, which from your perspective is really, really critical, because this is where you all live, I suspect, in providing things like tutoring and books and materials and financial aid for those things, whether it's uniforms or tools possibly even, or childcare, whether it's access to childcare on campus. I would love to know how many of you actually have on-campus childcare options for students. If you do, if you'd put that in the chat function for me, I would love to see what the mix of that is looking like in your systems. And also transportation, whether it's access to vouchers to access transportation. I don't know how many of you even assist students in working with nonprofit organizations in your community for automobile donations. We've done that in our community. That students can get a vehicle in order to be able to get to school if they're a single parent or depending on the program. And then also certainly access to public transportation if you live in a community where that's available, and providing support for students to be able to access those services. So support services is really, really important. And again, probably it's a difficult place around priorities because they can be significantly expensive, but sometimes they make a significant difference and really can help, especially single parents who have multiple, single parents, low-income students, students with all those types of barriers really need these. So, so far I only got one response about my question related to child care centers, so I don't know if that means the rest of you don't have them, but I'll assume that's what that means. And that it sounds like William is saying that the center has limitations regarding availability of students, for children to access it. And that also can be a problem. Access to childcare sometimes is limited by the availability of childcare. Then that can be difficult too. So if you all would just reflect for a minute and think about these root causes, and what I'd like to ask you to do, if you would, is to type into the chat function if you think that any of these are in play and that they're an area in which you think that you need to be focusing in order to provide students with what they need to be successful in a non-traditional career field, or your special population students to be successful in career and technical education, or in their academic pursuits more broadly. So if you were to pick one of these, which one would you choose to be as the one that you think is the biggest barrier on your campus? If you would just put that in the chat, and let's see what we come up with. I see a few people are typing. So school and classroom climate. Brandon says academic proficiency. Yep. So when you type in the box, don't forget to press the little bubble icon on the right-hand side. That's what pops it up in the window, in case any of you are typing things and letting them sit there. So transportation and childcare, sometimes classroom climate. Jessica says support services in reference to lack of transportation. I hear that a lot from students. That can be very difficult, especially if you're in a rural area or an area where public transportation is either limited or only available in certain communities, or not available at all. That's another difficult one. So Tony says Southern Crescent Technical College's Flint River campus has an on-site child care center supported by DFCS and privately paying parents. DFCS. That's an acronym I'm not familiar with. Maybe somebody can define it for me. Kay says classroom climate is a barrier for them. Sort of this, again, Kay, I'm assuming you're talking about this issue of people feeling welcome, supported, cared about, whether it's that's directed by teachers or by peers. Department of Family and Children's Services. Thank you, Jessica. And Kay says that's what she means around classroom climate. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next section and talk a little bit about family and then career information. So family characteristics, the research literature around family is very interesting, and there are just sort of 2 points that I want to make about this. One is the literature around family really indicates the fact that if an individual comes from a family where someone in their family has been employed in a non-traditional field, for example, my mother is an engineer, let's say. She's not, by the way, but if she was, I would probably be much more likely to become an engineer myself, because I know the field, I understand the field, and I've seen her as a role model for myself as a woman in that area. And so the barrier to accessing engineering as an occupation for me is significantly lowered by all of those experiences. So in terms of, so that's an important piece. Family engagement in terms of career choice also becomes really important. When we look at the research literature around career selection, the #1 influencer of student career choice and major choice in college are their parents. And so even in your case, where you're working with students who potentially are either non-traditional, they're older, or students who are coming to you directly from high school, for sure, their parents are influencing typically the decisions that they're making in relationship to the career that they're going to pursue, or even the major that they might pursue in college. Now, of course, the further away someone gets from the direction of parental engagement, then the more they'll be making those choices on their own. But certainly all of those aspects are influencing them for their entire life. So I'm sure we can all think about the times that our parents talked to us about careers and what was okay and not okay, or encouraged us from pursuing whatever it was that we wanted to pursue. So family engagement becomes really, really important. There's also some interesting literature that's mentioned in the document about the fact that men from low-income families are much more likely to engage in non-traditional career areas than men from more traditional families or middle-income families. And women from upper-income or middle-income families are more likely to engage in non-traditional fields than women from low-income families. So it's a little bit opposite of the two genders. And there have been a few studies that have shown that. So again, thinking about when you're working with students, socioeconomic status potentially can influence career choice. And especially if we're talking about looking at economic self-sufficiency, but certainly when we think about men in healthcare, those can be frequently high demand occupations. There are lots of opportunities and really good wages for a short-term certificate that they can earn in a community college, or even if they choose to transition through a career ladder to an RN degree through a baccalaureate program. So families involved in all of those dynamics. Career information becomes sort of the next critical component of this, and certainly whether it's misinformation, lack of information, too much information, or information that's only focused in a certain way, there are lots of influences that come to play here. And I don't know, and I'd love to hear from you all about this, about how much are you all involved in doing career guidance types of activities? And is this a significant role that you play as a special population coordinator in relationship to working with students on special population students on campus and helping them make career choice? And if you are, then there's some really great resources that I would encourage you to go look at. First of all, we have a great toolkit on exploring STEM careers. that I encourage you to go see, and you can go to our website and Google it. You'll find it easily. But the web pages that are associated with the toolkit also have lots of good links and activities, and there are lesson plans in here in the toolkit as well that may be useful to you. But the interesting thing about career information is, again, thinking a little bit about the micro-messaging work that we've been doing, is the types of subtle messages that occur through career information can speak really loudly. So I know I tell this story frequently. When a student comes in to talk with you about they want to enroll, if it's a woman, for example, wants to enroll in the auto technology program, and you might raise your eyebrows or look at them and say, "Are you sure?" Those send really strong messages that say, "Are you sure?" means, I don't know, maybe is that not a good idea? And that's a really strong message to someone who's already taking a big risk in making that choice. So one of the things that I would really have you think about is, how do you steel yourself in those circumstances to try to not react from your own implicit biases about what we think students should or shouldn't do. And I realize that many times we say to ourselves, oh, but I want to be realistic about what the program options are. And certainly that's important. But even in those cases, the way in which you present that information to your students can be interpreted as though you're discouraging them from participating. And reflect on the fact that if it was a young man that was sitting in front of you asking you the same question, would you be telling them the same information or asking them the same questions? So again, a lot of this is a little bit about your own self-reflection. The other thing about career information is access to information that's comprehensive, that includes everything from demand opportunities in your community. Again, I'd love to hear from you about, do your students, when they come to you, say, oh, I'm willing to go anywhere in the United States to get this career? Or are they saying to you, I want to stay in my community? And so, again, when they're saying that, or maybe they don't know, but historically your community, students stay in your community, which is typical. What are the opportunities that are available in your community? Do you know about them? And or do you have access to information about those opportunities? And what's the wage earning potential? It's a really important thing for students to understand. What are the educational requirements, so that they know what kind of program they need to be moving through? And are there career ladder options within those fields? So if they earn a certificate or a degree, or a short-term component, can they continue to come back and add to that? So stackable credentials, for example. All of those things are really important, and especially having a perspective about that in a non-traditional field where maybe the student doesn't have that much knowledge becomes critical. Early intervention here becomes really important, and I always talk about this, especially with college faculty, because many of the college faculty that we work with and people who, like you, who are in student support services, have an opportunity, a tremendous opportunity, to reach down, to take students from your campus into elementary schools, to do those informal types of activities with students that begin to sort of spark their interest in knowledge about career fields. Because what the research literature tells us is that career identity begins to get developed around the second grade, which is really, really early. And I think you all know, how many times do young children get asked the question, what are you going to be when you grow up, right? So thinking about that, early intervention activities is important, and that without those experiences, stereotypes can develop within students' interests and are reflected frequently by their own lack of information or knowledge. And certainly the characteristics of an occupation, potentially, whether they're biases or stereotypes about occupational characteristics. For example, what does it mean to be a computer scientist? Does it mean you sit in a cubicle all day? No, it doesn't mean that. It may mean you're out in the field, like in this picture, working with technology in terms of collecting data and then utilizing that data to solve problems. And a lot of students don't know that about many occupations. And so what are the kinds of things that you're providing them that give that information to them? So those are two other areas to think about. Any of these come to mind in terms of barriers that you think your students have? Do they come to you with very narrow visions of what career options are available to them? Can you answer that question in the chat for me while we move on to the next one? I see William is typing. Thank you, William, for being involved in the conversation. I appreciate the feedback from you. And while you're all thinking about that, I'm going to move on to the next section, which is the internal and individual section. And I'm going to talk about this only briefly because for any of you who've been involved in the micromessaging training, you know we focus on a lot of these theoretical frameworks. And I would never do justice in the next 5 minutes to any of these. So I'm just going to encourage you to do some reading in these areas. The document has some good information in it. There are some great references to some websites that you'll also find useful. So I would encourage you to study these a little bit more. But basically, we're talking about students' perception of their own abilities to perform, and do they believe? Self-efficacy is about beliefs. Do they have a belief system that says that they are capable, able, and can be successful? You'll see in the background there an image from one of our self-efficacy posters. Those are also available online. And so that can be a barrier. Attribution, again, attribution theory is a relatively complex concept, and I encourage you to do some reading about it. But this notion of, do students own their success? Do they actually believe that when they're successful, it's because of something that they have control over, that it's due to their own effort, and not due to good luck or some external factor that created the dynamic? Because those are unreplicable types of reasons that success can occur. So you can't predict that you'll be successful again. But attributing success internally is a replicable attribute, and is really the most positive attribution for students in educational settings. So thinking about how the way we reinforce attribution. We'll talk about those strategies next time. Stereotype threat. So do students believe that the stereotypes that exist about their own group, and are they in circumstances where the threat of that stereotype may suppress their performance? There's lots and lots and lots of research in this area. Great book by Claude Steele called Whistling Vivaldi. I would encourage you to read if you have an opportunity to do that. And then mindset, of course, which is Carol Dweck's work from Stanford around fixed versus growth mindset, and this notion of students who view intelligence as inherent and limited are frequently less able to persist. When they come up against a struggle, they'll stop, they drop out more quickly than students who have a growth mindset, which is really understanding that the process of learning and growing is part of the struggle, becomes really, really important. So those are the 4 internal or individual category areas in the document that support this. And so thinking about, when you listen to students, are they expressing things to you that say to yourself, attribution, that student, I need to make sure that I focus with this student on helping them own their success and feeling good about themselves, about their own self-efficacy, and have a growth mindset. And then the last item, or the last section, has to do with society. And frequently we think we have no influence over any of this. And however, these are often the teachable moments that you can use in your own circumstances. So whenever good old corporate America makes big mistakes, it's often when Computer Barbie comes out with a doll, the Computer Barbie doll in the book, where when she's trying to design a computer game, when it comes to the programming time, she has to go and ask her friends these two young men to help her, which is just unbelievable that Mattel could be that silly. Those kinds of things are frequently teachable moments. This was a Land's End catalog ad that's in this particular slide, advertising for backpacks for fall for students. This is for the girls' backpack, Chloe, which is light as a feather, tough as long division. So let's continue to reinforce the stereotypes about girls have trouble with math. But so media says things, and certainly there's peer pressure. We know the research literature around role models and mentoring is probably some of the biggest and strongest research that's out there, so you frequently hear lots of things about how important these kinds of programs are. But seeing someone who looks like you doing an occupation is frequently a way for you to make that connection and to engage. And then lastly is collaboration. How do we, as supporters of students and institutions that are developing programs, work together on a common mission in a collective impact type of approach in order to address these issues? So we had a couple of comments here. I just want to read them for benefits of those who can't see the chat function. Crystal says, yeah, we were talking about career opportunities and career information. Crystal says, yes, even as adults, they still aren't as aware of career options as they need to be, much less from a young age. William says, our commercial construction director did say once about how educating students about the reality of her occupational area is huge for her. Most hear construction in the program name and think hammer and nails, but fail to realize the true nature of their work, which includes very little construction. That's a really good point, William. Thank you. Commercial construction management. So the challenge I want to leave you with, and I know this was like the fastest review of root causes as possible, and that's why I'm giving you all these documents to use in the background here, is I want you to, between now and next week, which is a ridiculous challenge, but have you think about this, and certainly off into the future, is to think about how would you determine if these root causes exist? What evidence might you collect? Which of these really are causing some gaps that you're seeing? Which are the most critical? Which have the highest impact on performance? And which of these, if you were to choose them or find them, you have stakeholder support to actually address and try to impact? That's a critical part of your root cause analysis. So we've already talked about sort of which root causes were at your institution, but certainly as you're thinking about your hypotheses and what kind of impact you might have on these, you want to search for the most direct and the highest impact causes. Employ some sort of systematic evidence-based process, and we'll talk about a couple of strategies for that. Formulate and test the theories or hypotheses. In other words, don't assume you're always right. And actually the reality is it doesn't really matter what you think. I'm sorry to tell you that. What matters is what your students are experiencing. So how do you get to the bottom of that? So certainly drawing on current research and evaluation, which we've done through this document, is beginning of that, but using multiple methods and data sources in order to find these causes. So some of the things to consider if you really want to look into this more carefully is designing surveys, and we certainly have examples that we can share with you, and we do that through our training on the program improvement process for equity. There are equity audit instruments that are available too if you wanted to take a look at how equity is addressed on your campus more broadly, because it's about policies and procedures in addition to just programmatic instances. Potentially interviewing students is another good way to go. Sort of paying your own attention to what's going on around you and observing students is a part of that process. And even conducting focus groups where you would bring together students of like demographic characteristics or program participation, and comparing them to other groups that are different than them and asking them all the same questions and see what kind of responses you get from them about what are the things that they're experiencing. The student voice in this is probably the most important. So think of all the ways that you can access that in order to listen to them and hear what are the things that are holding them back from being successful or from pursuing a career field that they would love, but their world around them is telling them that's not who they should be. So reflect on equity as you're moving forward and doing this work, and I encourage you to think about this and to read the 2 resources, download the 2 documents that are in the download handout pod, and just sort of heighten your awareness about all these issues and see if you start to notice these things. So I know that we're a little bit beyond our 1-hour mark. We got a little bit of a late start as we were dealing with technical issues, but I wanted to go ahead and open it up. If anyone had any questions, I'm happy to discuss this with you. But if you need to leave the webinar now, what I'm going to ask you to do, if you would please, is to go ahead and browse to, you can click on the Browse To button, and I'm going to go ahead and open up this web page, which will, I think, also show on all of your web pages as well on your computers. And if you would just click the evaluation link and go in and complete the evaluation for today's webinar using the online system, I would really appreciate that. So, if you go to www.nape.us, you can access the evaluation there. Are there any questions? If anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand. I can unmute you. You can unmute yourself and ask. You can also ask a question in the chat box. Or it doesn't have to be a question. It could be a comment.
My comment. My name is Alvin Payton, and I got on the webinar a little late, but I got on about 10:15, 10:30. But
Okay.
I did a lot of good information, and I wasn't able to access the items you were showing. So my question is, will this be posted on a particular website where we can see some of the things you were talking about?
Yes. So if you go to napequity.org, that's napequity.org.
Okay.
On the right-hand side of the home page, there are a group of blue buttons, and you'll see one that says Root Causes and Strategies. If you click on that button, that'll take you to the entry page to our whole section that supports all the things that I was just talking about. So you can download the documents there. You can access the online version of the interactive piece. There are lots of resources and strategy suggestions, etc. And we'll focus on strategies next week. But the root cause, all the root causes stuff that we referenced today is there as well.
Okay. And would I be able to do the evaluation from that particular website as well?
Actually, no. The evaluation's on nap.us.
Okay.
So if you go to nap.us, you can get to the evaluation page. You'll see there are 4 buttons. Click on evaluation, and then you can select today's webinar as the event and go through it. It's very short. Ask you, I think, 3 or 4 questions, and it really helps give us direction. NAP is nape.us.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So William asked a question in the chat that says, how can I get more information on the micromessaging training? So William, there are a couple of ways. If you go to our website, again, napequity.org, and click on the YouTube channel that we maintain, there are a couple of archive webinars on micromessaging. You can certainly learn a little bit about it there. If you're interested in having us come and do training on your campus, all you need to do is you can either send me an email. I'll go back a screen so you can see my email address. It's at the bottom of the screen that I just popped up. You can send me an email, and I'd be happy to arrange for our Director of Professional Development to contact you, and you can talk about what options there are around training. Because the micromessaging program is everything from, we do some introductory pieces that are shorter term, half day, 1 day, couple of day trainings, to the full implementation, which is a full year-long academy, where it's 24 hours of training, the facilitation of a professional learning community, a capstone action research project by the faculty who are involved. It's a great, great program, and we've seen tremendous success in really changing the climates of classrooms from the teachers who are participating. And there's also a little information about it on the website. We have a toolkit called Non-Traditional Career Preparation, or Exploring Non-Traditional Careers, excuse me, that is based on the micromessaging framework, and that toolkit's available on the website. You can find it there as well. If you just go in the search box on the website and type in Exploring Non-Traditional Careers, information on the toolkit will pop up. You can also navigate through the menu system as well. So
Maybe.
I hope that helps. Yeah, Kimberly.
That might be something, the non-traditional toolkit, that might be something that TCSG could purchase for the colleges. So if you're interested in that, if you'd like to email me, I'm looking at ordering some things for the colleges, so that could possibly be one of those items.
Excellent. Great. So William, I hope that is enough information at this point. So there are a variety of things. So YouTube videos, toolkits, website, and then the actual training. You just send me an email and I'll direct you to the right person. Any other questions? All right, so if you would please, before you leave, go to nap.us. I'm going to put it in the chat box, too, in addition to having it up on the screen here. And complete the evaluation. I would really, really appreciate it, and it was great talking with all of you today, and we will continue this discussion next week. We have the Part 2 of this webinar will be on Thursday, May 26th at 10 a.m. And we'll be meeting in this same location. So the web link that you have from the last webinar will also work for this one. And Kimberly, we'll make sure we send you some information that you can go ahead and send out to everyone to remind them to participate. Does that work for you, or shall we just communicate directly with those who registered today? Yeah, I think you have a bigger list probably.
Yeah, if you want to send it to me, I can send it out. We've got several different groups that I'm sending it out to.
Okay, great. We'll make sure you get that today. All right. Thank you, everyone.